Hey everyone, Tony D with another hot take on Thanksgiving. I love Thanksgiving because it's a food-related holiday, and I love food. Um, but of course, every year we have people from the woke side of politics trying to say, well, Thanksgiving is racist and it's a terrible holiday and we should rename it. And the most shocking thing is this magazine. To me, it's very shocking. It's called Teen Vogue, and these guys are like, I don't know who's running it, but they are full blown communists. I mean, some of the stuff that comes out of Teen Vogue to me is just shocking. That they are teaching young girls, basically communism. But one of the things that came out of it is this video of Native Americans being very angry about Thanksgiving and throwing over a table with a Thanksgiving feast. Look, no one was innocent. No one is innocent when it comes to, any time period in history. When it comes to human beings, no one's a saint. Is Thanksgiving apocryphal? Of course it is. It was created at a time when people wanted to believe Americans, it's a very American holiday. We wanted to believe that, Thanksgiving was, we didn't take anybody's land. We were like buddies with the local natives. Now, that's not true, but it's also not true that we were genocidal maniacs bent on wiping them out at every turn. The Pilgrims were escaping religious persecution. That's totally true. Now, that doesn't make them saints just because they were victims of religious persecution. In fact, they were being used by the powers of Europe to, get a foothold in the New World and to stop causing trouble in Europe. I'm sure all the Pilgrims would have been perfectly happy getting a plot of land in Europe where it was more civilized, but they couldn't. So, in a lot of ways, it was either fight and get your butt kicked over in Europe, or go to the middle of nowhere and try to eke out a living at a farm. And you have to understand the time period as well. The time period is, the 1600s. Medical science wasn't that advanced. There was a lot of things that weren't that advanced. So when the settlers got here, and there were Native Americans, their reaction could not afford a reaction of like, oh, we're going to kill all these guys and take all their land. They didn't have the resources of people to do that. They just didn't. That wasn't their attitude. Their attitude was like, ooh, I hope these guys don't murder us, because they were outnumbered and outgunned. I mean, you're talking 1600s technology with muskets. If you're lucky to have your gun loaded, you might be able to shoot an attacker, and then good luck for the next 5 minutes while you're trying to reload. So, and it's not like these religious guys were heavily armed. They were religious. They had guns for hunting mainly, and protection, but mainly, they had to hunt. And, the idea that the Native Americans helped the settlers, that's not totally apocryphal. That's true, according to some of the accounts. But, it's probably greatly exaggerated. And we don't have much detail about that time period and what was happening, because the Native Americans didn't have a written language and they weren't writing things down. And the settlers, well, they were kind of just busy surviving, didn't have a lot of time to write things down. I mean, people wrote things down in journals and wrote letters and things like that, but, there wasn't a lot. And there were settlers who died. I mean, there was that settlement in, I believe it's South Carolina. Oh, what the heck was it called? It's a whole mysterious thing. They all got wiped out. No one knows what happened to them. Maybe it was a bad winter. Maybe the Native Americans killed them. You don't know. And you have to understand, this is a time period where you have to be very wary of people. Everybody was. So people would just build a cabin in the middle of the woods and knock down all the trees and try to farm the land as best they could and survive the winters. That's the way it was. So imagine you spend like 3 or 4 years building up a farm, get a few livestock, maybe capture a few animals. You're starting to get the lay of the land, how things work, and maybe you got a well, or I don't think they had pumps back then, but you got a well. Or you're nearby a good stream. Maybe there's some fish. You got a stockpile for the winter. It's you, your wife, 3 or 4 kids, young kids, and you're just trying to eke out a living to survive the elements. And then, 4 or 5 guys show up and just brutally kill you and take all your stuff. Who's going to report that? No one. No one's going to miss you. It's not like you're important. You were one of these religious nutbags that got kicked out of Europe, and you're just settled out in the woods somewhere, and 5 guys come along and kill you. They could be Native Americans. They could be white guys. Some of the guys they kicked out of Europe were criminals, and being a bandit in that era was a real thing. You could. People lived in the woods basically anyway. So in a nice winter month or summer months, you could live outside, have a campfire in the woods, and then, hunt when you got hungry. And then in winter, you needed someplace to lie low. You just find a farm out in the middle of nowhere, murder everybody, and you could live there for the winter. They did all the work. And then, and it's not like anybody's going to show up looking for these people. They're out in the middle of nowhere. So that's why people were very paranoid. That kind of stuff happened all the time, especially in the frontier. You couldn't just expect to live unless you were ready to defend yourself. You had to have guns. You had to be tough. Your hope was that you would have your kids would get old enough that they could defend the house too. You'd have a couple of sons early on, and they would be the oldest, and by the time they hit 13 or 14, they're tough enough that they can pick up a gun and a knife and, defend the family too. So it wasn't an easy life, and you could see how a ton of misunderstandings could happen in that era. And it wasn't like the natives were looking to wipe people out either under that scenario. Those people are very rare, those sort of amoral people who don't care. But they existed in every group. So they existed amongst the Native Americans. I'm sure they had serial killers. I mean, who knows? Who knows? You wouldn't be able to classify them as anything at that time. Nobody could. They would just be like, man, Fred, he kills a lot of people. Seems to enjoy it. I don't get him. So, it was probably a very tense situation. But by necessity, I'm sure the 2 groups coexisted for mostly the time, because most people, they just want to coexist. And it would have been tough for the settlers and the natives to even communicate, much less have an understanding of where you could go, what you could do. And, if you ended up shooting something, an animal that maybe was already wounded by the Native Americans and they'd been tracking it for a day and a half, and then you come along and blow it away and then take the kill, I mean, that could cause a huge problem, right? It could cause a huge problem just simply because the settlers had diseases that the natives didn't have any resistance to, right? So every time you meet these new people, these new pale people, people come back and drop dead. The first time that happens, you just say, well, that's a coincidence. Second time, it's like, well, that's weird. By the third time, you're like, these people are doing something. Bad mojo. They didn't really have the words or, how would you process that? Without medical knowledge, how would you even process that? People just die. People just come back to the tribe and die. So, that had to be a huge problem with dealing with the pilgrims for the natives and vice versa. So you're going to have situations in which there were incidents of violence, but it would be incidents on both sides. Now, you could argue that, well, the Native Americans, that was their land, the settlers had no business being there. Again, they didn't have much choice, and it wasn't like there was ownership. People just, settled, and that was their land. That was the time period. And you could argue that, well, they should have stayed in Europe, but that wasn't going to happen. Europe was exploding with people and exploding with religious, conflict or whatever you want to call it. Just wasn't going to happen. You expect that the Europeans should have just stayed on their own deal. Now, later, things got really nasty, especially in the American West. That's what most people remember. They remember the expansion out west, and they were just mowing down the Indians. That was a different time period, and that wasn't right either. But that had nothing to do with Thanksgiving, really. That was, a completely different incident. And really, Thanksgiving is just trying to teach children, hey, just because people are different, you could be friends. And that's a good lesson. And you shouldn't erase that just because, well, it doesn't totally comport with history, therefore it's gotta go. I mean, what do you want to teach these kids? Do you want to teach them that, well, white people oppressed the Indians and that's it? It's way more complicated than that. And you would have to drill down into a bunch of horrible murders and complex religious persecution, and they'd have to know all the context. And a lot of people just forget the context. Even the people complaining who are grown adults who supposedly studied this stuff, they are, partially politically motivated. It's not about teaching what really happened. It's just about gaining something politically and virtue signaling to everybody. See, we changed Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving isn't going to change, not anytime soon. And I, for one, am happy, and so is little Joan, because she's going to have some turkey. And we're just going to, keep celebrating. But we're not celebrating people getting murdered. We're celebrating something else. We're celebrating a holiday that was created with good intentions. And you could argue, the settlers didn't have good intentions, and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, that's not what the holiday's about. So, happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving. And we'll see you next time.